that. Okay, well, let's get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to, oh, there's some more people. Welcome to Special Conversations. I'm Laura Sims, the host of the program, and I'm so excited to have Carla Cantor with us here tonight to talk about hypochondria and this book, Phantom Illness, Shattering the Myth of Hypochondria. So she co-wrote this with Brian Fallon, who is a professor of psychiatry at Columbia University Irving Medical Center. And in it, she shares her personal experience with hypochondria, but she also kind of debunks a lot of myths around hypochondria, kind of tries to take away the stigma of that illness. And I just found it such a compelling read, and I was so impressed with the breadth of your research, but also how pleasurable it was to read not only your story, but case studies and everything that you included in the book. It's very powerful. Before we talk about the book, I wanted to just tell you a little bit about Carla. I know some of you may know, but she is the communications director for the Columbia University Department of Psychiatry and the New York State Psychiatric Institute. Prior to joining Columbia, Carla spent 15 years in the Office of Communications and Marketing at Rutgers University. She's also held editorial and public affairs positions at NYU Langone Health, America Online, and Medscape Inc. She's written articles for the New York Times, Psychology Today, and other national publications. She holds a master's degree from Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. So I think what we'll do to start is we're going to show a clip of when Carla appeared on the Today Show when this book came out a little while ago. And yeah, so we're going to start with that clip with this very high-tech machine that you may not have even seen before.
Have you ever seen this? This was what you used to plug into the lighter in the car to keep the kids quiet.
So cute.
The only one we had.
Okay, so I'm going to turn on and we'll watch. It's about a 3-minute segment on the Today Show. And I hope everybody can see it.
Maybe I'll come
You
over
can
here.
move to see it if you can't see it.
We just saw it this afternoon, so
Okay.
we'll hang that. It's great content.
Oh, it even has, I have missed that.
I know.
Yeah, right.
It stops soon.
Music to your ears.
From NBC News, this is Today with Bryant Gumbel and Katie Curran, live from Studio 1A in Rockefeller Plaza.
Hypochondria is a subject ripe for humor. Think of the chronic complaints of Felix in The Odd Couple, of a neurotic, self-absorbed Woody Allen in his movies, and most recently, think of George in Seinfeld.
I'm calling for my test results. Negative? Oh my God! Why? That looks good. Yes, of course. How stupid of me.
But it's no joke that as many as 10% of the people who see a doctor every year suffer from hypochondria. Author Carla Cantor says these people are not pretending to be sick and they can't help their behavior. Drawing on her own experience with the disorder, she's co-written Phantom Illness, Shattering the Myth of Hypochondria. Carla, good morning. Welcome.
Good morning.
You know, we all kind of smiled and giggled a little bit about George in Seinfeld, but in your view, it's really no laughing matter, is it?
I actually don't have any problem with the comedians. I think in some ways they've helped to bring hypochondria out into the open. And laughing at your foibles is not a bad way to handle it. But I think somebody has to be a crusader and say hypochondria has been the butt of jokes for so long and these people are really suffering.
How serious a problem is it? I mean, are there isolated cases here and there, or is it really widespread?
It's pretty widespread. The studies show that 6 to 10% of people who visit their doctors are suffering from some degree of the problem.
We're talking about 16 million Americans, is that right?
Possibly that many.
And it costs thousands, millions, or billions even of dollars in healthcare costs, doesn't it?
they're really beginning to look at this very closely because the initial studies are showing something like $20 to $30 billion is being spent in unnecessary tests and procedures.
Tell us briefly about your personal experience, because you were a hypochondriac, correct? For 20 years.
It wasn't something I knew. I didn't know I was a hypochondriac. It began in my 20s and 30s, and I would say that that's a very ripe time for hypochondria to begin. And I would fear a symptom. If I had a headache, I thought it was a brain tumor. I'd be very aware of the things going on in my body, and this waxed and waned over time. And when things really got bad was after the birth of my second child. I began to have all kinds of pains. I felt terrible. Some of it may have been hormonal, but the difference was, even if there were real physical symptoms, it was the way I interpreted it. I believed I had a very serious illness.
That's really the key, isn't it, Carla? I mean, all people might have some sort of physical symptoms, but a hypochondriac will interpret those symptoms much differently than someone who has just sort of your typical concerns about health.
Exactly. In my case, the fear became so intense. I was running to doctors. I wanted them to diagnose me with something because I felt so lousy. And I ended up going to the emergency room, and a doctor decided, you really belong in the psychiatric ward. And
So you got psychiatric help.
I spent one night in the psychiatric ward.
And that's all it took.
I knew it was a terrible mistake. It made me wake up. This was after 6 months of believing I had a serious disease.
Well, the American Psychiatric Association did classify hypochondria as a psychological disorder in 1980. It really isn't all in your head, and that's something that people don't understand.
That's one of the myths I'm trying to dispel. The symptoms are real. We all get muscle tension. We get headaches. If you take the average person and catalog their symptoms, one in 4 will have at least one symptom every 4 days: backache, headache, stomach problems.
Tell us really quickly, because we're almost out of time, how you can determine if you have these tendencies.
Well, I think what you have to do is take a look at how you've been behaving. Whether you're running to doctors, rejecting what they have to say, going to the next doctor, bothering your friends and family, checking your body, and if you feel your pain so acutely and your fears are so intense that they're ruining your life, I think you have to say something else might be going on here.
All right. Carla Cantor, the book is Phantom Illness, Shattering the Myth of Hypochondria. I know very little has been written about this until now, so I'm sure a lot of people will appreciate all your hard work. Thanks, Carla.
Thanks for having me.
And we're back in time today.
Boy, what 20 years can do.
Wow.
Katie, too.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that.
Right. Her voice sounds so different to we were going to talk about.
That's okay. So I think moving on, Carla is going to read just a little bit from the book.
Yeah. Oops. I'm going to jump around a little. I picked something that maybe, all of you might be able to relate if you can't relate in yourself. And it's about family. This chapter was called Family Ties, and I think it was called Family Ties in Sickness and Health. And this little section is called The Web of Connection. Children come into this world innocent and are quickly enlisted in the family arena. Things happen, and the family that was once our greatest hope for intimacy and connection becomes our greatest source of disappointment. I don't want to bring everybody down here. Dysfunctional behavior patterns like hideous heirlooms are handed from one generation to another. Thus we absorb character traits and defining labels. He's moody, she's demanding, a hypochondriac, just like grandpa. Parents focus on decoding a child's conduct, but ignore their contribution to it. Spouses loathe behavioral tendencies in each other, but refuse to look at the purpose they serve in their marriage. The bigger picture is lost. The joke about sending a hypochondriac to a desert island to make his symptoms disappear is meant to be facetious, but there is some truth to the notion that hypochondriacs are trying to say something that family members may be unaware of, unsympathetic to, or refuse to hear. Sickness exists in a social setting, the cared and the cared for, the helpful and the helpless. Partners, spouses, and others involved with the hypochondriacal loved one have several avenues of response available. They can coddle and comfort, become distant and withdrawn, express overt anger, or pull out, among other options. How a family reacts to complaints can influence the nature of an illness and how sick or disabled a person becomes. Each family constructs its own culture to make sense of its life and to make the system work. Sometimes in the struggle to maintain balance, or what family therapists call homeostasis, one individual gets elected the patient. Though the person may not be and often isn't the most troubled person in the household, he or she has a problem or is the problem. One more time. As the late Carl Whitaker, one of the pioneers of the family therapy movement, put it, the symptomatic individual becomes the family scapegoat, whipping boy, Christ, someone who agreed to suffer openly the stress of the entire family so that the family could remain stable. And I mean, that refers to much beyond hypochondria. But now I get into Salvador Minuchin, and he was like, you don't want to hear about him. And then I want to read another little section, Hypochondria as a Threat to Marriage. The scapegoat in illness dynamics doesn't necessarily have to be a child. One of the spouses in a marriage may unconsciously agree to be the problem. In some marriages, hypochondria can be the glue that holds the relationship together. One partner worries and complains, and the other responds with sympathy and attention. In others, health preoccupations can cause deep rifts and resentments. No couple purposely walks into a problematic relationship or plans to create a dysfunctional family. Nevertheless, emotional chemistry, the shock of recognition that it's as if I've known you all my life, is rarely blind accident. Something draws people together. Strengths complement weaknesses. He's gregarious, she's shy. He's ambitious, she's laid back. He's a complainer, she's so stoic. Whether a childhood was stable or turbulent, falling in love stirs up early feelings of safety, comfort, and dependency. At its worst, marriage travels a path of parental mistakes, unleashing a torrent of unmet childhood needs. At its best, it becomes a source of mutual support and satisfaction, a secure emotional base from which the partners can change and grow. And because I'm in the middle of the book, it seems like it's falling away from hypochondria, but what I won't read is the next part, which is about my husband and our marriage, which you can, and the role hypochondria played. And then I just want to read a little bit about the chapter called Between Doctor and Patient. It starts with a quote from Franz Kafka, to write prescriptions is easy, but to come to an understanding with people is hard. And it's from a short story of his called A Country Doctor, which is harrowing as his works are. I recommend reading it. It's online. So, the family who can sympathize with the fears of hypochondria and look beyond complaints without anger and judgment may serve an important function, providing a loved one with strength to cope and courage to seek treatment. But as sensitive and as accepting as family members may be to the plight of their hypochondriacal relative, they can go only so far in reassuring and guiding the sufferer through the daunting world of symptoms. The role properly belongs to the physician. It only makes sense. The doctor who possesses knowledge of disease and medical science, who touches the body, observes the spirit, and can decipher the meanings of signs and sensations, is best equipped to unlock the mysteries of hypochondria and work with the patient to separate the real from the symbolic, the alarming from the benign. Yet although the doctor-patient relationship can be a source of support, knowledge, comfort, and healing, this rarely happens. In fact, quite the opposite occurs. Hypochondriacs live in a world of cataclysmic uncertainty, that limbo of uncertain wellness. If they feel well, they cannot enjoy good health for fear that it will end. It is easy to see how, at times, illness might be preferable to the agony of incessant doubt. So I'll stop there. It's just a little bit that didn't have a lot of information.
It's interesting to think about hypochondria in terms of relationships. It's not like the role that it's playing, in a family. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Think about that instantly when you think of.
It's not just hypochondria. It
Right,
could be
of course.
anorexia,
Right.
or, all
Right.
kinds of
Right.
behaviors.
Right.
Yeah. It really becomes a systems problem, which I so strongly believe
Yeah.
is the root of many things.
Right. Well, so we know that hypochondria that it carries a stigma, and that people who suffer from it are ridiculed or seen as malingerers. So how would you, to help clear this up, how would you define hypochondria?
So I brought some cheat sheets here because if you bear with me, I want to give you a little bit of a hypochondria 101. The most important thing to know is that people who suffer from this are not malingering. The people who sort of do it on purpose, it's called Munchausen's, when they're making themselves ill and they know they're doing it, or Munchausen's by proxy. There's been some interesting TV shows on that, when you make a child sick. And, that too is probably, not their fault, but there's knowledge. When you have these disorders that come under the rubric of hypochondria, there isn't that self-knowledge. And I'll just try to do this quickly, because I think to understand it, you have to know this. So, what is hypochondria? It's really an individual who has symptoms of which no organic basis can be found. And most people with these conditions who have these physical complaints and these fears, they do not seek psychological help, they seek medical treatment. And the name for these people, they're not really hypochondriacs. In the modern lingo, they're called, or in the modern Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the Bible of mental disorders, they're called somatizers. And basically somatizers are people who experience physical ailments as in the soma, in the body, that really are more of an emotional or psychological nature. The NIH describes it as implies a tendency to experience and communicate psychological distress in the form of somatic symptoms and to seek medical help for them. It's the same thing, patients who complain of physical symptoms in the absence of relevant medical findings. And it's interesting because, it was interesting to me that, hypochondria has been this word that goes back in time to the Greeks, and it's been around for so long. And, when I wanted to write a book about hypochondria, it came out of some magazine queries that I was writing, and I had this friend of the family's who was an agent, and I told him I wanted to write a book. He'd always wanted me to write a book. He'd seen my stuff in the Jersey section of the Times when there was, and I brought him my paragraph or two that I've been trying to sell to a magazine, and he liked it, and he said, but let's not call it hypochondria. Mind body's really in fashion. You don't want to call it hypochondria. I go, do want to call it hypochondria. And that's what I want to do. And it was his wife, who was an English professor at Rutgers, Newark, who said, she is right. So, but the truth is, it's a loaded word, and what the great psychiatry profession has decided is that these somatizers, they suffer from what's called somatoform disorders. You can see soma is body. And, it's like any other mental disorder. DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, is there to categorize mental illness. You have codes, you can bill for insurance, but it's also the research studies, and they're really trying to create distinct diseases, and it's so much harder when you're dealing with psychiatry than other areas of medicine. These catch basins for these somatoform disorders, there are actually 5 of them. There are actually 7 because hypochondriasis has 2 subsets, but we won't go there. So you've got somatization disorder, which now I don't know if you all know people, but somatization disorder is probably the most chaotic of them. This is a person who really lives illness, not so much fear of illness, they are illness. It's debilitating, it's dangerous, the person has multiple physical symptoms, and their life becomes a chaotic attempt to find a cure for them. And often these people, especially before there were more limits, they would convince doctors to do all kinds of things to them, and they become a perpetual patient.
Sorry, how is that? How do you distinguish that from hypochondria?
Yeah, these are the 5,
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
So what they call now hypochondriasis, which is, probably stems from the old hypochondria, but it's defined in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual as a preoccupation with the fears of having or the idea that one has a serious disease based on a misinterpretation of bodily symptoms. This preoccupation must have been present for at least 6 months and persists despite adequate medical assurance. And that's what my problem was. Body dysmorphic disorder, it's imagined ugliness, or feeling you have a physical deformity, obsessed with your nose, breasts, reproductive organs, especially men. And then the last one, oh no, there's 2, pain disorder, and that's a preoccupation with like a body part despite physical findings that are not showing much. And the very good example of that would be the back pain that a lot of people really upset, it upsets them very much. And they might get surgery for back pain. And this was kind of dispelled by John Sarno, who some of you may have heard of. He was a surgeon, and he was with the Rusk Institute, and he finally stopped doing surgery. And he was one of the early advocates of looking at the mind-body connection and saying that much of back pain was emotional in nature. And the last one is
When was that? When was Johnson?
90s, early 90s. And the most fascinating one, though not uncommon, and I know you've all heard of it, is conversion disorder, because it's in the 1940s movies. And that's like the loss of, the loss of one of your bodily functions. And they're often very symbolic. A piano player believes they've lost their talent and their hand will become paralyzed, A soldier doesn't want to kill, and, some body part will. But it is, I was looking at that today, and children suffer from that as well, in terms of walking and talking and mutism, and they, they're traumatic. Some of it comes from traumatic events. And if we have time, I would like to read a short example of a patient I interviewed who had that. So I think that's the one-on-one part.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That's great. So I know Katie Couric asked you this already, but why isn't it a laughing matter? Why should we take, what are not only the personal reasons, but the kind of global reasons why we need to take it seriously, the impacts on various.
Well, I don't know so much about global, although I did write a chapter about, ethnic and racial subcategories of this, and there's a very peculiar form of it in Southeast Asia, and men in particular get something called koro, and it's this feeling that the penis is shrinking and going into the abdomen, And, yeah, so, but I don't know
Is
as
that
much about.
Body dysmorphia, would that be?
That could be,
part
yeah,
of
I'm
it?
sure, these categories probably overlap.
Okay.
But, yeah, it was some of the stuff I said on the Today Show, and I actually, you know, I have a pamphlet here, the 20 to 30 billion a year, which is probably more now.
That's the US healthcare system,
US
right?
healthcare system, and this is all from research. You know, I can't say that zillions of people are researching this, but there was a very intense contingent of researchers who took it very seriously, and, you know, I probably interviewed all of them and read everything, you know, all the papers, and, you know, there were hundreds of them. And hypochondriacs and somatizers, they consult doctors 4 times more often, have medical bills 10 to 14 times higher than the national average. 6 to 10% of people who visit physicians exhibit some degree of hypochondria. And so, you know, it's very costly, and, you know, it's on a continuum, of course. You know, there is, you know, the Georges and the Woody Allens, you know, they're functioning, they're hypochondriacs, but they're also fictional.
I like when you said you liked the way comedians handle it, because it brings attention in a good way, positive way to the
Well,
problems.
everybody, you know, when I would tell people I'm writing a book about hypochondria, inevitably they'd say, oh my God, you should meet my husband, you know. So everybody kind of, you know, knows about it, or knows somebody, or maybe is that way themselves. But, so there is the lighter level of it. You know, the old joke, on my grave, it's gonna be, I told you I was sick.
And how did you come to the place where you wanted to write a book about it? And like,
Yeah.
and was it kind of a form of therapy too, to write it, or to help yourself as well?
You know, it was really like the book chose me.
Yeah.
You know, I was a freelance writer at the time, and it was the SSRIs had just come out, and, you know, I talk about this in the book, in the prologue, but I literally read an article in the New York Times about a guy named Arthur Barsky, who's one of the foremost people in his field, and it was patients refusing to be well. And I don't know whether it was the right time for me to suddenly, you know, realize, it's very hard for someone to say, you know, that this isn't real, but, you know, if you're lucky, you know, to get over these disorders, and anybody who knows somebody eating disorders similarly, this whole defense mechanism, you know, there's an unconscious, it's working for something. So, you know, I recognized it, and I called Arthur Barsky in Boston, and I said, I read the article about your work. Do you know anyone in New York? And that's where Dr. Fallon comes in, because I heard I called Dr. Fallon, who was, ironically, I work with him now. You know, that's much later in life, and we're still friends. And Dr. Fallon had gotten a lot of money from the National Institute of Mental Health to study what was called heightened illness fear. And the SSRIs were just coming out, and the study was to see whether, I know it sounds so archaic, but now that SSRIs are such a thing, but to see whether it worked on these fears. And he had 4 clinics in Staten Island, in Brooklyn, Connecticut, and Manhattan. And I went to see him, and, you know, basically his study was placebo-controlled, and, you know, I wasn't gonna go there. So on my own. In fact, my mother said, don't go there. Don't
You
do
might
that.
get the placebo.
So, yeah. So, you know, I did. I dealt with it, and the SSRI at that point in my life was amazing. It was, you know, I think other people probably had that experience. Unfortunately, it poops out. You know, it doesn't always stay that way, but it was a really amazing experience. And Dr. Fallon tells the story of my calling him up and saying, you know, do you want to work on a book with me? Because that was his big field. He was known for that. And we were talking, and I said, he'll never forget. I said, now you have to make sure, because it's kind of like a marriage.
And how was it to work with him?
Well, the thing is, the only thing he did was write the foreword and review all my material.
Okay.
And it was really weird because it was always going to be my book, you know, foreword, the prologue, and I go in and out. I try not to be too intrusive in this book. But when we got Houghton Mifflin did the bid, and then we accepted it, and then they came back to us and they said, oh, by the way, as you can see, it says with Dr. Brian Fallon.
Yeah.
They said, we want it and Dr. Brian.
Oh.
And they dropped it by 10K.
Wow, because you said no.
Because it was one little word, but he was totally supportive. He said, this is ridiculous, I don't want it, that's not appropriate.
Right.
And so he was just wonderful. He gave me access to all his patients. And, you know, of course, it was up to them, and they had to sign a HIPAA form, and I disguised them in the book. But it was so great because I was able to share my story with them, and they were very open with me. So I do have them in the book. I did change a lot of the fact, you know, the recognizable, but they were wonderful people. And
You should share one of them.
well, you know, there's a more typical one. Oh, I'm so
That's okay.
sorry. It's the other
Where
side.
it
Other side. There's a more there's the more typical ones, but I really would love to share the conversion disorder.
Is this the nun?
The nun.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's a good one.
This person was not part of Brian's study, but it was a family we knew, and we knew of the story, didn't know this woman so well. She was relative to somebody. And I asked if I could interview her. Hope I can find it. Nah. I thought I bookmarked it. Maybe I bookmarked it in this one.
Oh, wait, I'm at 60.
You know, you marked it?
No, but I just,
Okay, I found it.
okay.
Okay. All right, it's called Mary, a Nun Story. When Mary, a mother superior of a group of nuns, was 36, she inexplicably became blind in one eye. On graduating from high school, Mary decided to enter a convent, and by the age of 21 had taken her vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. This came as a shock to her family, who, although they were practicing Catholics, had been far from religious. I had a great need to help people and do something spiritual and good, Mary recalls, but I think that if there had been such a thing as a Peace Corps back then, I would have been a volunteer. For the first decade, she enjoyed the sense of community and the studious aspect of a convent life. She earned a bachelor's degree and a master's in education, and was appointed principal of a parochial high school where she taught literature. But as time went on, she became disenchanted with the church, which she felt was out of touch. She found herself counseling pregnant high school girls against abortion when she thought abortion seemed to be the most reasonable alternative. Though she tried to work within the system, she was seen as too way out, too liberal. The church required blind obedience and no disagreement, which is ironic. Mary began feeling nervous and anxious. She was rarely sick, but one day developed soreness in the back of her eye. Every time she moved it, she felt pins and needles. She splashed cold water on her face and took aspirin, but the pain wouldn't go away. By the 4th day, she couldn't see out of one eye. A neurologist said it was optic neuritis, a diagnosis for nerve inflammation of unknown origin. She was hospitalized and given cortisone, but her sight didn't improve. Whatever it is that's bothering you, you've got to get a handle on it, the doctor told her. Mary took a leave of absence and spent the good part of the next year in less stressful convent in the countryside. She began meeting regularly with a psychologist. They talked about her strange life of silent prayers in the morning, teaching all day, disillusionment and conflict. I discovered I was a perfectionist. At the age of 37, she arrived in New York City with $300 and landed a college teaching job, working her way up to assistant dean. In 1971, she met a successful New York investor on an airplane. They were married a year later when she was 43 and 8 years out of the convent. She now has 3 stepchildren and a grandchild she adores. She has since passed away, but I can tell you what happened to her after that, which a little bit of that is in the book. I didn't continue reading, but she, believe it or not, for the next 30 years became, I think, or maybe 20, became the executive editor of 17 magazine.
What? That's so bizarre.
But it's true. It's
From the
really, it's
convent
true.
to 17.
Yeah. Now that's a very,
Yeah.
that's an outlier, so, okay.
Right, but there is usually this symbolism to whatever happens, right?
Yeah,
Like the
but,
blindness.
compared to the other kinds,
Yeah,
the fear of illness and the living your life as a patient,
Right.
those are the most common.
yeah. And did you have feedback from, other people suffering from hypochondria or physicians when the book came out or through the years?
Well, I have to say, we developed this pamphlet for physicians to let them know. I don't know if you've heard that, something like 50% of medical students develop hypochondria. They think they have every illness the first year, so they've seen it. But I didn't really interact with doctors, and I think where I got my kudos was from the mental health community, who the hypochondriacs didn't see. So, it was like preaching to the choir there. But,
Right.
the most rewarding thing were the people who I reached. The patients I interviewed, and the most wonderful experience, the internet was kind of, SSRIs and the internet were, and I saw something came up and it had a picture of my book and it says the book that saved my life.
Wow.
And, it never fails after all these years. It used to be a few times a year, but out of the blue, they'll find me and, thank you, or I need a referral, or my wife, or whatever, and, so,
Yeah.
yeah.
And what do you think has changed since the book came out? Especially in terms of the medical community's treatment of hypochondria?
Yeah, we touched on that a bit. I think SSRIs have been great. Whether people recognize it or not, I think they do a lot to deal with anxiety. Health anxiety is part of that. So SSRIs have been a big improvement, although I wish they haven't come up with anything better since then. So, the other part of this is the mind-body medicine movement, which has been around for a while. We're integrated medicine, psychosocial, looking at psychosocial aspects of disease. It really, it's trying to come to the fore, and there are people who embrace it. But on the other hand, when you have insurance companies, mandating that doctors can see their patients for 15 minutes and, not covering things. And, the one good thing out of the medical coverage issue that may have been positive, but I don't think it was for any good reasons, is that since my day when I used to be able to get any tests I wanted, because that's what doctors will do to get rid of these patients. They just go for this, go for that, you know, MRI, whatever you want. And they don't allow that anymore.
Right, now it's limited.
Because of the costs.
Right.
But I don't really think the problem's gotten better,
Yeah.
you know. And, you know, it's like every 10 years somebody writes a book on hypochondria.
Really?
Yeah.
Have there been good ones that have come
Yeah,
out since
yeah,
that
I think you meant, we were talking and you asked about inspirations.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, there was, you know, I thank her in the acknowledgements. There was a writer, Susan Bauer, who wrote a book called Woeful Imaginings. And I like that title. I was like, oh no, I'll never find one. And it was University of California Press, and so it was more academic than mine. But it was well written and fascinating, and she actually wrote a blurb for my book. But the biggest inspiration for my book was William Styron, because I don't know how many of you have read Darkness Visible,
Yeah.
but he is really a hero to me because you know, he's the author of Sophie's Choice, and he suffered, you know, from I mean, it was a depression that probably, you know, he might have ended his life, and the treatment of it was terrible with halcyon. And but he was the first one, and he's such an eloquent writer, to do this very short memoir and be so candid about what he went through to help other people. And I read that, and I think he published that in 1992. And I was so inspired by it. And years later, I was at a conference, some kind of psychiatric conference, where he was getting a prize. And I introduced myself to him, and I told him, you know, your book, you know, really changed, you know, had such an influence on me. And it was nice. So, yeah.
Thank you. I want to make sure people have time to ask questions. So if you have any questions, please, yeah, Mary.
You know, now because you can get so much info online about illnesses, whether it's, you know, from a trusted source like Mayo Clinic, or whether it's just, you know, anecdotes from people, you know, how do you think that has impacted this?
You know, I'm sure it has. The media love to write that story, but I had a copy of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and I'm telling you, you don't get better than that.
Yeah, that's the one with the paper thin pages,
No,
right?
that's the
Is
Merck.
that the one?
The Merck
Oh, that's the
Merck.
Merck man.
No, right, no, it's like, oh, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, I didn't mean, that's mental health.
That's
No,
right.
this is the big tome of, yeah.
Yeah.
You know, so I had, mine was autoimmune diseases, and they're like the ones that are really, really hard to diagnose. There's no definitive,
Yeah.
like lupus and multiple
Right,
sclerosis. And, you know, it's like, okay, 7 symptoms from column A, and it, you know.
But on the internet, you have, like you were saying, like anecdotes, which can be really terrifying because they aren't from a credible medical source.
Oh, I know, and that's why I think, you know, some brands have risen to the top. Mayo Clinic,
Yeah,
WebMD,
right.
you know, doctors reviewing the material.
Yeah, exactly.
You're not gonna shout out?
Mount Sinai?
Rude, that's what he does for work. Credible videos, great content.
That's what your husband does?
Well, I work, I mean, those are academic, those are brands you trust, but other commercial brands, never mind, we'll argue about this.
This is trouble.
Yeah, this is trouble. Any other question? Yeah.
So first of all, I just loved listening to your sentences as you read them to us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And you gave us a little bit of a flavor of the origin story, your origin story, for the interest in this subject and the drive to write about it. is there an origin story you can share about Dr. Fallon? You know, I'm always amazed by what, you know, biomedical researchers decide to put their time into.
I'm so glad you asked me that. Dr. Fallon, he grew up on sort of the wrong side of the tracks in Boston. Irish Catholic, not a wealthy family, went to Harvard and became a doctor. And he initially was going to be a priest. Say no more. So anyway, I don't know what drew him to hypochondriasis, but I'd like to tell you a little bit about where he has gone with it now. For a long time, he was really one of the top people in this field. And then his wife, who's also a psychiatrist, got Lyme disease, and it was undiagnosed for a really long time. So she became one of these mystery. And so he ended up going into neuropsychiatric Lyme disease and tick-borne illness.
Wow.
And he has become, he runs this huge center. He's really become a renowned person. There are no openings, people from all over the world, because these are people who are desperate. And he doesn't take the position that these symptoms aren't real. I mean, he's looking, there are all kinds of research being done in Lyme disease, and you know, to try to figure out what is happening in the body. But he also treats them like whole human beings, and you know, the thing is people can be hypochondriacal or all of those categories even if they're sick. I mean, we were in Florida and we met one of my uncle's friends, and he was a great tennis player, and then he got diagnosed with Parkinson's a year ago, and the guy was just saying, it's just another experience for me to go through. I mean, the attitude was incredible, and then, you know, you can have a person who, it's their life, that has become who they are. And of course, Parkinson's isn't a good example, because that goes hand in hand with depression often, physiologically.
Yeah.
Well, I want to ask a question because I probably know it, but I would like to just make an observation people might find of interest as the husband, more just for the general writing part of it, because I guess this is a talk about writing as well. And it's hard to imagine this book was written before the internet, so a writer had to go to the library, you know, the journals she's talking about, she had to go find them and copy them, and I mean, the amount of work, I honestly don't know how you would do it. I think it's just an amazing thing that just the process of writing, you know, you couldn't share your draft as a PDF with your editor in a second, and I don't even know how you even really did it.
Well,
But I just finished the one key thing, though, the one key message, though, that I think is relevant to writers is, I think we went to a conference, and the question was asked, how do you write a book? And the answer was, you get a belt, and you strap yourself to your chair. And I did witness my wife doing that, in a sense, going up to her room, I mean, a little cubicle upstairs, shutting a door, and insisting that she work on this thing every day, all the time, for like a job. And I do think that's relevant to any writer who wants to try to create something. You really, no matter what it is, fiction, nonfiction, you have to strap yourself to the chair. And I saw that happen, and I thought that was really remarkable.
So I know there are a lot of, thank you, David.
You're welcome.
Yes, good job, David.
Little kids at the time?
Yeah, they were little kids.
Over here.
That's intense dedication.
So I know there are a number of writers in this room, including yourself, and you know, I think I really admire people who can write fiction well. I have a really good friend, one of my best friends, who wrote the book Losing Isaiah. I don't know if it was made into a movie with him.
I know the movie,
And he always says to me, he goes, oh my God, how can you write this nonfiction? I just get to make it up.
Yeah.
You know? But there's nothing I like better, and Ivan, you may be able to relate to this, is just like going into the weeds, just going into the weeds and trying to come back up. and explain it to people.
Yeah.
Important things that people should know, and, make it
Make it readable.
understandable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you thought about writing another book?
If the right subject came
Yeah.
along, right now it hasn't, so I've done everything in the last few years from physics and astronomy, which was hell.
You mean you've written about physics and
Not, for articles,
for
yeah,
articles, yeah.
but my job changed to psychiatry, which
Right.
is like kid in a candy shop.
Yeah.
I have questions.
Yeah.
I feel like I should know this as your daughter, but I don't feel like you covered the why of why hypochondria. Like, what is it covering up? What is it serving for the person? Like, you could just share a little more about. I know it's not an easy question,
No.
but like, what is it about it? A distraction?
At the end, if I can just find this quickly, and this would be a good thing to end on in the epilogue. With a dream. Oh, sorry about this.
It's okay, take your time, it's important.
All right, I might skip around a bit, but this is the epilogue. Not so long ago, I had a dream, a true hypochondriac's nightmare. I am in a hospital room following brain surgery. A doctor grimly approaches my bedside, leans down and whispers into my ear, "Sorry, we weren't able to get it all." In the next frame, my head bandaged, I am frantically informing friends, acquaintances, anyone who will listen, that it is over for me. It's not fair. I haven't lived enough, I whimper. There hasn't been enough happiness. I need them to soothe me, care for me, make me well, but the crowd is powerless. They stand mute, pitying me, yet wishing I would go away. Waking with a shudder, I instantly recognize that raw confluence of emotions, terror, rage, isolation, despair, and self-absorption, which seem both foreign and familiar. The strange thing about the dream is that at the time of its conception, I hadn't experienced such feelings in nearly 2 years. I made note of the dream in my journal, but did not realize its significance until later. Not only had the dream carried me back to the hypochondriacal torment that had inspired me to write this book and reconnect me viscerally to my fellow sufferers, it revealed something else, that while the dark terror of hypochondria no longer held a grip on the major fabric of my life, its fiendish spirit was not far away. It had abided within the shadowy territory of the unconscious, shielded from daily existence perhaps by the safety net of a pill, the absence of immediate trauma, an absorbing work project, or maybe, I want to believe, a more solid barrier of maturity and personal growth. I'm going to go down a bit because I'm going to answer your question, I think. One thing I am sure of is that people who are so sensitive to the reality of human frailty and the inevitability of death that they sabotage the only life they possess can never be happy. Paralyzed and incapable of giving or taking pleasure, they are unable to grasp that life can be lived another way. For as perverse and destructive as hypochondria can be, it is more than a disturbance of the mind-body relationship. It is also a natural response to the human condition. Its very ordinariness accounts for that smile of recognition people give at its mention, why its clinical picture over 2 millennia has remained so constant. If you are a sensitive, intelligent, and thinking person, you have to be at least a tad hypochondriacal merely by being alive. Otherwise, you're oblivious, in denial, and automation. Sometimes, even to the most resilient of us, all right, I'll just read the ending. As I come to the close of my odyssey, I hope I have succeeded in accomplishing what I set out to do. Erase a stigma, debunk some myths, lend some illumination to a puzzling, perpetually elusive malady. If reading this book helps people feel more kindly toward themselves or toward someone they know, or bolsters the relationship between doctor and patient, then I will feel that the effort has been worthwhile. If we continue to stay hypochondriacally miserable, in the end we will doubtless have won the ability to proclaim, oh, this is the I told you was sick. At first I thought that allowing a little more joie de vivre into my life would make me more afraid to be struck down, but it seems to work the opposite way. If I did get that bad news now, it would be utterly terrifying and tremendously sad, but not quite as frightening or tragic as it would have been 4 years ago when I was hypochondria's prisoner. Because using your energy in less destructive, more gratifying ways puts a whole lot more life under your belt. You become an older, more satisfied person. On a few occasions, I have driven by the hospital where I spent that pivotal night and stared up at the place and wondered, was there really a time when I thought that life could possibly be better inside, cooped up, away from my family than out? For most of you, the road to overcoming hypochondria will not be paved with epiphanies or critical events. Rather, it will evolve with a series of small steps, sometimes unnoticeable. The real mark of success may come when you least expect it, like being ready to kiss a child goodnight or chatting with a friend on the porch and suddenly realizing I hadn't thought about it for a while. Or sharing a bottle of wine with your spouse at the waterfront restaurant where you became engaged more than a decade ago, and you're wishing you could live forever, not because you're afraid, but because you're so happy. Such moments may be fleeting, but the contentment they bring can be permanent and worth striving for. Because when the time comes to say goodbye, you want to do it serenely, not kicking and screaming, I haven't lived. Sure, I'd like to make it to 90, who wouldn't? But I have come to realize that quality is indeed more worthwhile than pursuit than quantity. And whether I have 10 more years or 50, the texture of my life is one of the few variables over which I have some control. When my number is up, I don't want to be hooked up to oxygen machines and breathing tubes in a cold, sterile hospital, but surrounded by loved ones at home. I hope not to feel sorry for myself or want others to pity me, but to sense how blessed my life has been, how much I've come through, how many people I've cared for and have cared about me. And when I'm gone, I want my children to say, boy, she loved life. That's the way I hope they remember me. Their mom. I didn't answer the question.
That's a good place to end, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you so much,
thank you all for
Carla.
being
Thank you, Carla.
Thank you so much. And
Wonderful. Yeah.
thank you, everybody, for coming. For those of you new to Special Conversations, we have these every couple of weeks with different speakers. And I have a little sign-up sheet over there if you'd like to get on my email list. I don't send a lot of emails, like once a month, just to let you know what's coming up. And in 2 weeks, on March 23rd, we have local South Orange resident and modernist scholar extraordinaire Anne Fernald coming, and she's going to give a talk for Women's History Month on 8 modern and modernist women writers. So, yes, you have a question?
Is there a copy of the book available in the library?
There's not, right? Oh, in the library.
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
there it is.
Oh,
Yeah.
you
Okay,
know,
good.
you said, this is one sentence. You said you wanted to live, I have to do this because this, you won't believe. Okay, this is in my acknowledgements, and I say, no less important than the physicians, mental health professionals, and assorted experts whom I interviewed, the research librarians who assisted me, and the well-stocked libraries in Maplewood, South Orange,
Wow.
Newark, and Seton Hall University.
Nice.
Yay.